Hello, I am Luba Vangelova. I am the founder of The Hub, which you can read more about at thehub.community. And I am joined here again today by Dr. Peter Gray. Uh, Quick intro from you, Peter, and then we can get started.
Thank you, Luba. I'm happy to be here. I'm Peter Gray. I'm a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College. Long retired from teaching, but continue to do a lot of research and writing primarily about children's play and children's needs for play, about how children learn through play and other sorts of independent activity.
All right. And the last time we spoke a few months ago, which is also up on the Hub's YouTube channel, we talked about what adolescents need to thrive. And you mentioned, some of the needs revolve around autonomy and getting opportunities to socialize and play and so on. But today, I wanted to talk about something a bit more nuanced. And it's something you and I were discussing by email, so I'll just fill people in as to what prompted it. But I was reading a series of tweets about a father who was giving his son a set of challenges. And initially the boy didn't want to do them. He was 13 and it involved hiking. Um, but then he decided he did, and then he backed out of them, then he changed his mind again, whatever. And then at a certain point, the father decided he would not give the son a choice, and that this was going to be a rite of passage that would benefit his son. And he essentially made him do it. He accompanied him on this lengthy hike. And afterward, apparently, the son was just thrilled to have accomplished this. And looking back on it, was glad, according to the father, that, he had been compelled to do it. But it's not the only instance that I've seen of such things. I mean, I've seen grown people post on Twitter and elsewhere saying, things that their parents made them do when they were younger. And looking back on it, they are grateful that their parents did that. And they say, they have good relationships with their parents. It didn't, in their minds, negatively affect their relationships with their parents. So, can you share your thoughts as to when and if compelling a young person to do something is actually the beneficial thing to do, beneficial for the child?
Yeah, it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. But it's an interesting question, and I think that, first of all, I don't think there's any generalization here. I don't think there's any generalized answer. So much depends on the kid, the relationship between the kid and the parent, the world that the kid is growing up in, what are the other options, what's available. So that I don't think that there's any hard and fast rule. Like I wouldn't say, oh, it's just never appropriate to insist that your child does something or to really push them to. I wouldn't say that it's never appropriate to do that. Um, here's one realm. This isn't exactly what you raised, but here's one realm where I don't think that most modern parents push their kids enough, and that is helping around the house. I think that kids, as part of the family, should be taking a role in the work around the house. And that used to be common; everybody did it. And in cultures where this is expected, kids start as toddlers doing it. Well, they
Mhm.
want to do it. They want to help,
Mhm.
and then they grow up helping. And I think kids get a good feeling about that. They're not just somebody who's being given to all the time. They're also giving. They're taking
Mhm.
a role. They're part of the family in sense. I think we is almost part of our overprotection of kids, that we're protecting them from doing any real work around the house. So I know that's not the question you are raising, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of, well, there are some things we ought to ask our children to do, not just for the sake of the child, for the
Mhm,
sake of the family, but it
mhm.
is also for the sake of the child that the child should be helping out. So I think that's a big loss. I think throughout human history, even in the best of societies, children helped around the house, and when you grow up feeling that way, it gives you a sense of I'm a contributor.
Mm.
I'm not just a weak person who needs to be helped and taken care of. I can also take care. I can do my share of the housework. I can cook meals. I can even paint my room or other rooms if so that's my first response to that.
So if we could just because that's an interesting point. I think a lot of parents, and you mentioned when children do this, they often start as toddlers, or at least wanting to. The desire is there, if not the ability. And I think a lot of parents just feel they don't have the time or the energy to deal with how long it takes and how much they have to then, fix when the
Right.
children are young. And so if they didn't start when the children are young, and if they wait until the children are more capable, it seems it's probably difficult to actually start then, wouldn't you say? And if so, do you have any suggestions as to how to um,
Right.
go
Yeah.
about that?
So first of all, for people who have young children, uh, you're right. I mean, at first the child is going to be more, the child who helps you sweep up or pick up. There's some things even little kids can do. They can pick up stuff off the
Mm,
floor. They can, I remember my son by 3 was washing dishes. He could actually stand on a stool at the kitchen sink and wash dishes. Little kids want to do that, and we make a mistake not to let them or even encourage them to do it, because when they start doing it, at first maybe they don't do it quite up to your standards, and maybe it takes more time because you have to redo it, or but it's well worth it in the long run, because by the time they're 7 or 8, they can really be truly helpful, and certainly by the time they're teenagers, if they grow up with that sense. So, and if somebody didn't grow up that way, and so you've got a teenager around the house. So here's an interesting thing that we did a little study, not a little study, it was actually a big study during COVID. I don't know if I told you about this in our last conversation, remind me if I did, but through the Let Grow organization, when schools were locked down for COVID, we did two very large scale surveys of families that had children between the ages of 8 and 13. One survey, schools locked down in March of 2020. Our first survey was a month later in April, and the second survey was in May of 2020. And there were 1,600 families in each survey, so this was a big survey. And half the families we asked the questions of the kids, and the other half we asked questions of the adults. So, among other things, we were interested in what are the kids doing while they're home, right? And very interestingly, a lot of parents said, who knew my son or my daughter actually wanted to cook dinner? And who knew they can actually do it? It took a little help, but now they're doing it. They're doing their laundry. The older kids is taking care of the younger kids. So here they are, they're home, they're not rushed around the way we rush around kids all the time. They're not having to go off to school. They're not being carted off to other things. So they've got time and they're home, and they can see that there's stuff to be done, and they volunteer, or they respond. So I think the kids are not as reluctant necessarily as we think they are, but we've got to give them time for it. We've got to let them know we appreciate it.
mhm,
We've got to also not, if a parent is going to insist on their standards, that it be done just the way they want it, then yeah, they're going to have to do it, or they're going to have to pay somebody to do it.
Mhm.
But it's well worth relaxing your standards a bit
Mhm.
and letting your child do these things, because this is part of growing up. This is an important learning. Children today are not learning how to cook. That's more
Mm.
important than most of what they're learning in school. Right? But
And
we protect them from learning how to cook
mm,
because we want to save their time for studying for school.
mm, mhm,
So so that's one realm. I realize that's not exactly what you're asking. You're asking, well, for the sake of the kid, the kid who doesn't seem to be doing much, who seems to be maybe shy, should we push him out to do something social? The kid who seems to be a little timid, should we push him to do something that requires a little bravery? Um, I think you have to be really careful about that
mhm,
because it can so easily backfire. Of course, you can always find case histories for everything. You
mhm,
know, I mean, you've got these famous people who have achieved great things. You know, like Tiger Woods, or who says his father got him, almost insisted that he practice golf by the age of 3 or 2 or some thing like that. And then he goes on to be this famous multi-billion millionaire golfer, and probably happy that his father insisted on all of this. There's the occasional chess player who is so happy that their parent insisted that they really work on chess when they're little. I guess the Williams sisters, great tennis players, they also were kind of pushed into tennis at a very young age. So sometimes that works out. But let's assume that our goal, I think it's a mistaken goal to try to think what we're raising as as a world champion at something. Why would we want to do that? I mean, world champions aren't even all that happy necessarily. Why do we need more world
well,
champions?
that's the thing. It all depends on, yeah,
Yeah,
who knows what their internal experiences inside their heads, even if outwardly they seem,
yeah.
successful.
And,
So,
and then you hear stories like I have a um, my family goes way back in New England, almost to actually literally to colonial times, and so I hear stories from a uncle of mine, actually a great uncle of mine. He was no longer with us, obviously, but who spoke about how his father would tell him to clear the rocks in the field. And so he'd carry the rocks. There's all these stone walls in New England that are made of rocks that were carried out of the field to clear the field.
mm,
So the boy cleared the field, and he said to his dad, "So I've cleared the field." And the dad said, "Okay, now carry the rocks over to the other side of the field." That's you hear those stories, and this is told lovingly. This is told like, "Oh, my father, he had such a work ethic, and made me do this stuff." From today's perspective, that seems a little stupid, but
yeah.
but I guess the point I'm making is, you know, we have this ability to look back in our memory and think of things that at the time may have been really unpleasant and annoying, but when we look back at them in our memory, we kind of nostalgia, they've
Mm,
become part of our nostalgic picture, right? And so I was so glad. So people talk about, I mean, God, there are people who talk about being glad they were in the army, even though it was a terrible experience. There are people who talk about being glad they had some terrible disease that they managed to recover from because they learned all these great lessons from it. But you
mm,
wouldn't choose these things,
mm, mhm.
or at least most people wouldn't choose these things. So it's a big. I remember. I mean, another problem. I have this experience. Um, so I grew up very free, a lot of self-directed adventures. I grew up with my mother and my stepfather, and once in a while I would visit my biological father, who I didn't really know. but he had somewhat different views about what boys should be doing than my parents did. So I remember this experience of visiting him, and we were at a swimming pool. And I was not the most courageous kid. I did a lot of adventurous things on my own with other kids, but there were some things that I was not the kid who would do something that seemed risky to me. So he thought it would be good for me to dive off the high dive at this pool. And I was probably about 10 years old, and I remember feeling shamed. I remember feeling like walking out to the end of that um, of the diving board and standing there and shaking. And people were getting mad at me because I was holding them up, keeping them from, and I just felt like that was a shaming experience. And I
Mm.
still think it was a shaming experience. That was not something that a parent should be telling a child to do. It's not something the gym teacher should be telling a student to do. Things that you're a little bit afraid of, you want to do it on your own, at your own time, when you are ready for doing it. You don't want to do it in front of other people, so you've got to be really careful. You've got to really know your kid if you're going to try to insist or even encourage that they do something that they're not completely ready to do.
So I remember way back when we were having, lots of discussions, and Peter Bergson, who, for those of you who don't know who that is, he is the founder of several self-directed education centers. He had mentioned, I remember, the example he used, because he was arguing that it was more of an art than a science. And this anecdote stuck with me that the example he used was if a child is learning how to ride a bike and they think they can't do it, but the parent knows they can. And they've judged that they are ready to ride their bike, and it's just fear holding them back. And he said, in an instance like that, he thought it would be justified to basically push the child, beyond their comfort zone because the parent knew that the child was capable and that they just needed, like, underneath their protest, they actually needed and craved a push. So what would be your kind of view on that?
Yeah, I can see that. And again, it depends on what you mean by the push. Um, so I think all of us, I mean, one way to think of it is how would you, suppose you recognized in your spouse that there's something that your spouse is holding back on that they really could do, that they would be better off if they did. How would you encourage them? You wouldn't say, oh, you have to do this. You would say, I know you could do this. I bet you could do this. I'll be there to help you do it. You know, I helped my wife learn how to swim a little bit. I was a swimming instructor. My wife wanted to go out kayaking and canoeing with me, but she was a little bit afraid of it because she considered herself to be a bad swimmer. So I remember encouraging her. I bet you could swim. Your memories are that you are like a lead weight and you'll drop, but I don't think that's true. So let's go out and try it. So that would be the approach I would take. If hey, it's a lot of fun to ride a bicycle. It's sort of sad that we even have to encourage kids to ride bicycles these days. Kids don't ride bicycles these days, almost never, except during COVID, we saw kids riding bicycles.
Mm,
But the real problem is that the real problem, and I think why we sometimes have to encourage our kids to do things is that the very things that kids always did because all the other kids are doing it and they're all playing with them and the other kids are encouraging to do it in
mm,
a more natural way, not an authoritarian way. Hey, I'm having fun on a bicycle. It'd be great if you could come with me and let me show you how. That's so much more healthy but we've kind of destroyed that world. And maybe we're trying to compensate by, because we're seeing kids aren't in self-directed adventures that they're doing with other kids naturally. We want to create these adventures for them in a somewhat artificial way because the dad isn't the right companion to be going bicycling with the kid. You know, I can see the dad saying, you know, it's a good idea to start learning how to ride a bicycle, but the kid needs other kid companions for riding a bicycle. The kid needs other kid companions for going out hiking, for doing all these kinds of things. And we've sort of destroyed that. And I think we need to be really working on bringing those opportunities back.
So um, it's interesting you say that because I mean I know not there are people who would not agree with you there and see no issue with a parent going out cycling with their child or what have you. So what do you see as the role of the parent then? And is there any? Do you see any downside to such parent-child experiences?
So in terms of bicycling, I mean, let's say the kid likes to bicycle and the father and the parent likes to bicycle and they decide they want to bicycle together. That's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. What I am saying there's something wrong with, the only kids I ever see on bicycles at all these days, there's a parent right behind, as if they're there to protect the child. They don't trust the child. They're frightened. And that child doesn't want the parent there. That child wants to be more free. That child would be much happier with another kid there. You know, we're sort of substituting ourselves for friends, and
Mm.
kids really need other kids as friends, and that's the problem I have with it. I don't, and again, I think that I think the problem is we're in a world today where we've deprived children of real peers. And we adults are trying to substitute for that. So instead of peers daring you to do something new or encouraging you to do something new or say, joining me with this and that, and let's go on this adventure, let's go fishing together, instead of that happening, we adults are doing it with our kids or pushing our kids to do it, or maybe we're doing it with our kids in the hopes that the kids will like it and will start doing it. And I can understand why we're doing that, but it doesn't take the place because we're there protecting them. We're there as authority figures, and we're taking automatically their own sense of self-direction away when we do that. Because the mere presence of somebody who's much bigger and more powerful than you, has all in every way power over you, telling you to do something, that is kind of belittling to you. That kind of diminishes your own decisions and role. And again, I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I'm saying that I would say anybody should think very carefully about it before doing it. Is there really a good reason for doing this? Wouldn't I be better off wouldn't my time as a parent be better spent figuring out how to make it possible for my son to have friends, real friends, and to be playing and exploring away from adults?
Mhm. Okay. And what about uh, kind of more abstract, academic, career-oriented things? So, well, or not even necessarily that. I mean, there are some people that, by their nature, I think maybe tend to say no to things initially. Like when something new is presented, nah, I'd just rather keep doing, what I'm used to doing. Would you say that sometimes, like, uh, I mean, I guess it depends how you define push, but would it ever be, in your view, beneficial to kind of compel someone if you know that their natural response to most things is no to anything unfamiliar, but how else, how do they widen their their world. And I mean, you mentioned the role of peers and how peers can help widen the world, but let's say there isn't enough of that or whatever. How do you view it in a case like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can see the temptation. I'll tell you what my observations were when I first got a lot of my research initially years ago was at the Sudbury Valley School, which is a school that is sort of a non-school in the sense there's no imposed curriculum. There are kids there from little kids from 4 years old on through high school age. And the staff members have a policy of not only not requiring the students to do anything, but not encouraging them or pushing them to.
Mm,
Because the belief is that the biggest thing people need to learn in life is to take charge of their own life. And the belief is that we all, at some level, take charge of our own life. Now, we all have very different personalities. Some people are go-getters, some people are have a different kind of personality. They're not interested in so many different adventures and so on and so forth. And I've seen both types and grow up and go on to find adulthoods. So here's the situation. You can imagine at first this took a lot of restraint on the part of the staff to follow their own position. You'd get some, with little kids, it'd be no problem. So they'd come and they'd play, they explore, and if they stayed on to school, they developed interests, and you'd look at them, and they're very. But sometimes you would get a kid. And oftentimes, I should say, you'd get a kid who was a teenager when he came burned out by school, and he would just sit there. He or she would just sit there and presumably do nothing. It looks like they're doing nothing. They're just doing nothing. Maybe they're listening to music. Maybe they're hanging out, talking with another kid who also appears to be doing nothing. And the temptation is to say, how about this or that? Wouldn't you like to do this or that? But the belief on their part, the belief on the staff's part, was that would be counterproductive because their belief is that kid is almost tempting you to tell them what to do. It's almost like I'm just waiting for you to tell me what to do. And the staff members are just saying, are saying to themselves, not to him, I can wait you out. I've got infinite patience on this. you know? And so they'll sit there, and after a while, and sometimes it's a long while, sometimes it's months,
mhm.
they'll start to do something. And and they decided to do it. They took control. And I think that, and so that I had that lesson of experience that what Danny Greenberg, who was the founder of the school, used to say is if a kid is bored, let them be bored. The boredom stirs the soul. Let them be bored until they can't stand being bored anymore, and then they'll finally do something, and then they'll finally figure out what they want to do. There's another way of looking at it too, which my son always says when people ask about that question. He's now a staff member at the school after having been a student at the school. He's now long been a staff member at the school. And that when people ask him about so and so just seems to be doing nothing, he says, it's not possible to do nothing. You're always doing something. And we have no idea what that kid is doing as he's sitting there. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so what about the fact that, I mean, adults with their much greater life experience and so on, I mean, they have perspectives that might be useful to help guide, a young person that their same age peers would not. I mean, you mentioned about kids, you know, daring each other or introducing each other to this and that. But I mean, a child isn't really going to introduce another child to, like, probably to a certain um, knowledge of a certain career, for instance, that may actually really enthuse the other child, or um, there are certain things that it would seem that peers would not really be well positioned to introduce or to guide toward. So then, um, isn't it beneficial to have the more experienced adults kind of guiding and steering?
So the way I see that is that adults play a very valuable role in being models. Adults play a very valuable role in their presence. I think adults need to be honest with kids. I think so. So, for example, when I look at the Sudbury Valley School, or I look at some families, including the family I grew up in, let me take the family I grew up in because it's an interesting one. My mother never told me what to do. Um, and partly because she never told me what to do, I was always wanting to ask her what she thought I should do. She didn't impose herself upon me. So I would say, so what do you think if I were to do this or that? Or, and I didn't always follow her advice, but this is the way she was with all four of her sons. And we all grew up to be very independent, responsible people in charge of our lives. And I think it was partly, it might be partly genetic, but I think it's partly that we grew up in a family where we were very much respected, but we were not directed. You don't
Mm,
have any difficulty finding out what's out there if you are free to move around out there. If you hear, so a great thing about a school like Sudbury Valley is even if you come from a family that is kind of isolated, let's say it's a family that nobody even reads. Nobody, there are a lot of families, even rich families where nobody reads, and or nobody really talks about politics or philosophy or religion or yeah, and those kinds of things. Suppose you come from one of those families, whether it's a impoverished family or rich family, you go to this school and you're surrounded by people who are intellectuals, who are doing interesting things, who are reading books, who are talking about ideas, who are arguing with one another about this or that, and you get exposed to it. You see little kids see older kids doing interesting things. They're cooking in the kitchen, or they're little kids who can't read see kids reading. They see kids playing more sophisticated video games, more sophisticated. They see them climbing trees. They see them doing all kinds of interesting things, and then they want to do them. So the exposure is quite natural, and this is the way throughout history kids were normally exposed to the world. They were part of the world, at least part of a portion of the world, and they saw what people did. I also think one of the reasons that kids are so interested in television and now in the YouTubes and social media and all of this is because they're learning about the world that way. We don't allow them so much opportunity to see what adults are doing directly,
mm,
but they explore it indirectly. They learn about things. They learn, my stepdaughter, this is going to sound terrible, but my stepdaughter, when she was maybe about 12, 11 or 12, she would come home from school. She was going to a conventional school. She came home from school and she would sit down and watch soap operas on television. This was before the computer era, of not too long, or at least before the social media era. So she'd sit down to watch soap operas, and I remember saying to her, I'm not, by the way, I think adults have every right to express their opinion about anything. I used to tell my son, I think those video games, I hate the violent video games. I didn't forbid him from playing them, but I said, I hate him, and I'll tell you why, So expressing your opinion is a good thing. It's almost dishonest not to.
mm,
But that's different from controlling. So I said, aren't those really stupid? What are you doing? Sitting there watching this stupid soap operas. He said, and I remember she said to me, well, I know they're stupid, but but here's what I like about it. First of all, she said she was interested in acting. She was starting to be an actress, so she was interested in the way they acted these parts. But in addition, and I thought this was really insightful, she said, so it's interesting to watch these adults and the adult situations they get into and how they deal with them. So
mm,
she's kind of learning, this is a learning experience for her. She's viewing,
Mm,
it may not be, and they're not all that atypical. They may be dramatic and exaggerated, you know. So she's learning something about adults. See, I think we worry sometimes about exposure. I think that if anything, kids are overexposed. There's too much stuff that they get exposed to and
mhm.
too many choices. And the main thing, you don't have any difficulty figuring out what the careers are out there, but the main thing is I think that it's important that you have the opportunity to experience people doing the things that are kind of crucial for a whole variety of careers. It's valuable to have the opportunity to be involved with people who do mechanics of one sort or another, who aren't afraid of plumbing, to have an opportunity with people who read, who write, to do things in the kitchen that involve numbers, to be living the way unschoolers put it, that it's important to be living life. And life exposes you to so much of the culture unless you're living a very narrow, limited life. And so the families that do unschooling, I think, are best. The families that do unschooling are best where the whole family is involved. It's not like you're pushing the child to be involved. The whole family is involved in interesting things and activities. The parents are involved in the community, and so the kid gets involved in the community.
And what about, so you mentioned that your mother didn't compel you to do things, but you sought her opinion on things. Would you have perhaps not been as receptive to what she had to say if she had been offering those same things without you actually asking and seeking out her opinion, do you think? I mean, is there sort of
Uh,
often a kind of a pushback because one feels like one is being kind of imposed on a little?
I think everybody hates unsolicited advice, no
Mm,
matter what age they are. I still hate it, even when I know it's good advice. You know, when I advise another person, or I want to do it in some way that doesn't even seem like advice, and similarly, that's the way I would want people to advise. I think that human nature, one way that I kind of have come to understand human nature was through this research I did on how hunter-gatherer people live and get along with one another. And I have never lived in a hunter-gatherer culture. I have a colleague who did for many years. And I surveyed in this study, I surveyed 10 anthropologists who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures. And I asked every one about children, how are children treated in the culture that you observe? And every one of them said that the children from basically age 4, when they're regarded as having sufficient responsibility, on through the late teenagers are free to roam and play basically all day long. And and it's part of the cultural, and I asked, so what about teaching? And it's part of the cultural belief that it is insulting to somebody to teach them something in any kind of direct way. It's insulting to somebody to tell them what to do or to act like they don't know something. And what is, even to me, was remarkable is they apply this to children as well as adults.
mm,
So if they see somebody using an axe and they're not using it right, they won't go up and say, well, let me show you how to use an axe correctly. They'll go, as a way, if they think it's important, they'll go and they'll kind of within sight of that person, they'll start using an axe the correct way. So that the child has the opportunity, or the adult, if it's an adult not using it correctly, the opportunity to see it, but they haven't gone through the insulting thing of being told you're doing it wrong and here's how to do it. I think there's almost like hunter-gatherers absolutely depend upon the goodwill of one another. They depend, they have to cooperate all the time. They live by sharing. And so having really good relations with one another is very, very important. And so part of that is not to act like you know more than somebody else. Even
Mhm.
if you do know more than somebody else, you don't act like you do.
Mhm.
And they don't treat children differently. I mean, this is hard for us in our culture to believe. Now there are some exceptions. You would tell a child, those mushrooms are poisonous. You know, there are other things you control. The poison darts you keep way out of reach of the kids, of the small kids. Uh, and also because that's a culture that really frowns on any kind of competition or fighting. They will stop little kids from fighting. And the kids seem to get over that very quickly. Other than that, they simply let the kids grow up, and the kids are growing up in this environment where they're able to see what other people are doing. So we used to more or less provide that kind of environment where kids could go, even 5 or 6 years old. I, I could go shopping for my parents. I could see what people at the grocery store did. I had a paper route by the time I was 10. I knew what it was like to collect from adults who don't want to pay you this week. You have real experiences out there in the real world, and that's the ideal way that kids grow up. And I think we need to get back to providing the opportunities for real experiences. Now, when I said that my mother didn't ask me to do anything, that there is an exception, as I said before, about chores. We all had to take responsibility. It wasn't like she had to make us do it because we did start it when we were very young, and I think we felt like this was our responsibility. She would remind us to do it. She would say, "Hey, you haven't cleaned your part of the room yet, and we're having guests. I wish you would get to it now." So
So,
she wouldn't go and do it. She would say, this is your responsibility to do that.
so, um, I I know that you use the word ask as the verb there, and parents do tend to use that verb. I've asked you to do this, but really they're telling, wouldn't you say? And if someone is telling, then does it have to come with a consequence if it's not done? I mean, um, yeah.
It's an interesting question. It is an interesting question. I think that ideally, on things like this, I think if kids are raised early, as I said early on, with the expectation that you're part of the family, you're going to help out, I think that people do. But I think that there are some cases where you do say there are consequences, and I think that's true whether it's a child or whether it's your spouse. So let's say you're married to somebody who's taken the paycheck, including the paycheck you earned, and going out drinking and drinking up the check. That's intolerable. So you don't just say, "Hey, please." After a while, you don't just say, "Hey, please." You say, "Look, there are consequences. I'm leaving you if you don't stop that." And let's say you've got a child who's doing something that is truly harmful, either to the child or to other people. You you can't divorce your child, unfortunately, some parents would say. And it is your responsibility. If your child is doing something criminal, if your child is doing something or something that is truly harmful, taking drugs that are truly going to mess up their nervous system and destroy them, the parent, I think, has an obligation to stop that. And please may not be enough. And then you may have to say, there are consequences. You know, we're gonna sit down. We're gonna have to figure out how you're gonna stop this, or I'm gonna have to do something like put you in this rehabilitation program that you don't want to be in, or I'm going to have to do something like this. I think there are situations like that. I also, in terms of consequences, let me also point out that there are Sudbury Valley had consequences. And so it was not like people, they refused to call themselves a free school because they said, no, this is a school that operates by the rule of law. This is a school that operates by rules, and the rules are made democratically with every student and every staff member has a vote. But the rules are enforced. And so let me just take an example of a rule. So one of the rules at the school was if you take out toys or anything, you have to put it away when you're done because people get tired of having to pick up after other people. And so, and this was enforced even on the 4-year-olds. Some adults would say, "Oh, how could you expect 4-year-olds to do that?" Well, this school believed 4-year-olds can do that, and history showed they could do that. So if a 4-year-old left toys out, somebody, not necessarily a staff member, it might be another kid who was annoyed the toys were out. They wanted to play with this puzzle, but the puzzle pieces were strewn all over the floor. They would bring up the child who didn't put it away to the judicial committee, which is a jury of your peers, made up of a mix of the ages of the whole range of the school. And they would say, so and so did violated this rule about putting their things away at the end. And the first time there might be just a warning. You've got to go and clean it up now. But the second time, there would be a consequence, like all right, for the next week, or for the next, first of all, maybe for the next 2 days, you are not allowed in the playroom. You're not allowed playing with any of those toys in the playroom because you didn't put them away. So there would be consequences, but the consequences fit the crime, and the consequences were things. And I think what's interesting is the purpose of the consequences wasn't for the good of the child, but I think it was for the good of the child in the long run. That the primary purpose of the consequences was for the good of the whole organization. That in order to operate as a school, there are certain things that people have to agree to do. We can't make noise in the quiet room. We can't litter. We can't bully one another. We can't we can't if you're a very little child and don't know how to swim, you can't be walking on the dam where you might fall in, and there would be consequences for violating those rules. So I think there's nothing wrong with consequences. But I think the consequences should be such that there's a good reason for the consequences, and it's not just all about because I think this is good for you as the child to do this. Um,
Mhm. Okay. And so, in terms of compelling children, do you think sometimes it's um, kind of a result of parents almost trying to live vicariously through their children and, trying to get them to do things that the parents actually would like to be doing if they were children again? Is it sometimes difficult, do you think, for parents to kind of separate their own wants and needs and um, from their children?
I'm sure that that's true, and it's not even just their own wants and needs. It's also what parents um, perceive that the society wants of their
Mm,
child, or perceive that their beliefs, often misbeliefs, about what the child has to be doing to have a successful future. But I agree, some of it has to do with some people. It was a little bit of a challenge for me. I happened to be an outdoors kid as a kid, and I was outdoors most. I'm still outdoors as much as I can be. I love the outdoors. I'm love nature. I love as a kid I was into all kinds of sports. I had a kid. My son was absolutely not an outdoors person.
mm,
He is a classic nerd. By every call it proudly he says so. I would tell him about the great outdoors, and he would say, if I want to see a tree, I can call it up on my computer screen. So I had to come to accept that. I went through a period of time, I'm not insisting, but I had a period of time saying, hey, let's go out and kick the ball around. So he would dutifully come out and kick the ball around a little bit with me. But his heart was not in it, and so I had to adjust. I had to say, all right, this is not my kid. I have to admire him for, if I'm going to admire him, I have to admire him for what he is, who he is. He's somebody who reads way more than I do. By 5 years old, he was reading way more than I did. He was reading, by 10 years old, he was literally reading a book a day. I mean, he was a classic indoor nerdy kid on the computer. The only game he played was Dungeons and Dragons. It's he turned out okay. He didn't turn out like me, but the world would be awful if everybody turned out like me. We want we want a variety of people. We need to, and we should be proud that our kids aren't like us.
All right. And I think that's a good place to end. Good time to end also. So thank you very much and appreciate you, talking this through.
Thank you, Luba. Great questions.
Thank you.